Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. I'm SocietySucks and today I'm checking out why didn't Castro try to retake Guantanamo Bay from America. The name Guantanamo Bay sounds familiar. I've heard of it before, but I don't really know what it is. Obviously, I'm guessing it's an area in Cuba or close to it since we're talking about Castro and the United States. So yeah, let's see what this is all about.
The entire island of Cuba famously does not belong to the Cuban government. You see, this small part here, the southern part of Guantanamo Bay, has been home to an American naval base since 1903.
Oh.
And as you'll likely know, there have been points during that time where the Cuban and US governments really didn't get along. And throughout the premiership of Fidel Castro, when these relations were at their lowest point, he wasn't able to retake Guantanamo Bay for himself and his country. Which raises the obvious question, why not? Why didn't Castro and Communist Cuba try to take Guantanamo Bay and make the island whole once more? So, to learn how Cuba ended up in this position,
they knew it would end terribly for them?
Not you, not this time. In the closing years of which the Cubans revolted against Spanish rule. Like most revolutionaries before them, the Cubans imagined that they would get to keep all of their territory upon independence.
Nope.
Fun fact, no. Their war against the Spanish soon caught the attention of the US of A, and after a main sinking, calls to remove Spain's last imperial territories from the Western Hemisphere grew rapidly. Now, many Americans wanted Spain out of Cuba, but that didn't necessarily mean that they wanted Cuba to be free.
Yeah, they wanted it for themselves.
The less expansionist members of Congress passed the Teller Amendment, which, as part of the act giving President McKinley the right to intervene in Cuba, made it clear that the United States was not allowed to keep it. Now, the government being forbidden from annexing Cuba is not the same as being forbidden from annexing any of it. And during the Spanish-American
they just can't
War,
take
the US
all of
found
it.
that Guantanamo Bay was well suited as a naval base, mostly because it gave much quicker access to the rest of the Caribbean, which was useful for keeping an eye on any European ambitions there. And so, after the Spanish were defeated, Cuba was occupied by the United States, which agreed to leave once the new independent government was up and running. Now this independence came at a price, because the Americans had just passed the Platt Amendment, meant to override the Teller Amendment. And Washington not only wanted the naval base as well as this island, but also the perpetual right to intervene in Cuba, should it do anything that threatened American interests there or in the region. This was begrudgingly agreed by the Cubans in 1901 because what real choice did they have, and 2 years later the US built themselves
just with a gun to their head,
which they would lease for a small annual sum. This led the Americans to by and large ignore their claim on this island, and eventually it was just sort of agreed that it was now Cuba's. Over the next decades, the US routinely intervened against any destabilizing forces in Cuba, and steadily began to economically dominate the island. This continued until the early years of the Cold War during the fractured rule of President Fulgencio Batista. Batista had a great relationship with the United States, in that he was happy to sell Cuba to it in return for Washington propping him up, and maintaining the base at Guantanamo Bay meant that the US and its help were never too far away for him. Over time, he became much more tyrannical, and so resistance to him, notably by students with communist sympathies, increased massively, and soon resistance turned into open rebellion. To combat this, Batista strengthened the military, which promptly tried to overthrow him, but failed. He then opted for the tried and true response of purging the army, which did keep
strengthen his own army, only for them to turn on him. And then he purged the army, which definitely didn't make anyone else feel safe around him.
Loyal to him, but it did mean that the inexperienced people now running it weren't as capable of dealing with the rebels. Said rebels were by and large a mishmash of different groups with varying objectives, barring the ousting of Batista, that is. However, the largest and most effective group was the July 26th movement, led by a certain Fidel Castro. By 1958, said rebels were in control of these parts of Cuba, and after Batista rigged the end of the year election, the US stopped providing him with weapons, which of course made things much easier for the rebels. And within a couple of months, Batista had fled, the revolutionaries were in charge of the major cities, and the Cuban Revolution was over. Mostly. Kind of. Well, not really. You see, the coalition of rebels were now in charge, and whilst they could put their differences aside fighting against a common enemy, when it became clear though that not everyone could get what they wanted, tensions rose.
Once the common enemy is gone, they're gonna fight each other.
So he got to choose the new interim president, before telling said president to make him prime minister. He announced that there would be elections, but don't worry, he banned all opposing political parties too, so that he, on behalf of the people, could take all of that troublesome and tiring thinking out of the process. He would soon change his mind and ban elections altogether, but long story short, Cuba was now Castro's, barring the short-lived rebellion by his former associates. Now, it won't surprise you to learn that Castro and his fellow co-revolutionaries didn't believe that America's ownership of part of Guantanamo Bay was legitimate, and they argued that it was an agreement between the USA and a dead government.
Well, good luck kicking out the US.
It would be nice if the US Navy just simply left. Now, running a country after overthrowing its government means that some things are naturally going to get overlooked. And one thing that the new communist government did was to cash the American check for the Guantanamo lease. Now, Castro claimed that this was an oversight, But the Americans quickly claimed that by accepting the money, the new rulers of Cuba had legitimized the lease, and so therefore, no backsies. Obviously, that's not really how things work, because it's not like Eisenhower or any of his successors would have handed Guantanamo Bay over anyway. And in the decades following this, the Havana government was sure to never cash another one of those checks. And it maintained that the United States had absolutely no rights to the base, or anything else on Cuba, which is why the government nationalized basically everything and their former American owners got nothing in return. So Castro obviously wanted the Guantanamo territory back under Cuban control. But he wasn't a dummy. Whilst the US garrison there was small enough that he would have been able to capture it fairly quickly, it's not like the US would have just simply accepted that its soldiers had been killed in its territory.
Yeah, had he actually tried to take Guantanamo Bay back, he would have seen himself being removed from power and Cuba no longer being communist, because the US would have definitely intervened and just completely destroyed all of them.
Territory attacked. In fact, not only did Castro and his government refuse to consider attacking the US base there directly, but during the first years of their rule, they were terrified of the Americans invading Cuba to remove them, which was a fair concern because that's what they wanted to do.
Well,
now,
if they did attack the base, that would have definitely happened.
The right to intervene in Cuba, part of its constitution, if America's interests were ever threatened. But actually, it wasn't, because Franklin D. Roosevelt had given up that right in the 1930s to improve relations with Cuba. He still kept the base, though. That was just useful.
Well, that was
Their
dumb.
fear actually came from the fact that the United States was a hegemonic superpower and could do whatever it wanted in the region with very little pushback. In response to Castro's takeover, President Eisenhower embargoed the country and began preparing for an invasion of Cuba. Not by the US military, though. Castro was seen as far too popular with the Cuban people, and the worry in America was that casualties would be far too high. Instead, this invasion would be undertaken by exiled Cubans who opposed the new government. Eisenhower left office before this plan could be enacted, but John F. Kennedy, his successor, went ahead with the operation.
I'm quite sure this invasion failed.
Would take place here at the Bay of Pigs, and it did not go well. Castro quickly won, and as a result his relationship with the USSR improved greatly, because they believed that if Cuba were to be uncommunistified then it would make them look weak internationally. As a result, the two intensified their military alliance and the Soviet Union stationed nuclear weapons there, and thus, Cuban Missile Crisis. During this, the US base on Guantanamo took a new importance for both sides. The Americans evacuated civilians from the base and massively reinforced the garrison there to deter any offensives from Cuba. This wasn't going to be a problem though, because the Soviets there had just opted to point a nuclear missile at it, meaning that it would have been vaporized 15 seconds after everything went wrong. Now, Castro saw this crisis as an opportunity for him.
I mean, to be fair, yeah, the base would have been vaporized if a nuke was launched. But if a nuke was launched, the rest of Cuba would have also been vaporized by American nukes.
Him to regain Guantanamo. When the three nations began to negotiate over how they could all not die, Castro listed his demands, which he hoped that the US would agree to in return for the nukes going back home. These demands were that 1, the US would end the economic embargo, 2, it would stop trying to off Castro and overthrow his government, 3, the USA would respect Cuba's sovereign waters, 4, the same but for Cuba's airspace, and 5, it would of course return Guantanamo Bay. JFK didn't want to do any of this, and so he did something clever. He claimed to the USSR that this disagreement was solely between superpowers.
Exactly.
And that Castro shouldn't be allowed to torpedo negotiations that were so important. And Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, agreed because Castro was kind of hard to work with. And by ignoring Cuba's demands, he had a better chance of...
I mean, Castro really was just a little guy who got into power, but really, he's not calling any of the shots. Let's be honest. The USSR was calling all the shots. Castro and Cuba was just basically a Soviet puppet, in a way. A Soviet puppet very far away from home who really only accepted their help and their missiles because they didn't want the US to screw them over. You get what I'm saying. Castro didn't have any real power. Especially, he had no ground to negotiate anything.
Getting what he wanted. This obviously wasn't.
He was reaching way above his station.
After the crisis was over, the Soviet Union promised to keep some troops in Cuba, because at least that way, if the US invaded again, then the Soviets would be forced to get involved. But outside of that, the Cubans didn't really get much from the crisis. And the US, not even for a second, ever considered handing over its naval base.
Exactly.
And after this, the Cubans weren't really able to do much about the Americans on their island. They wanted it gone, and the Americans didn't want to leave. And given the massive disparity in power between the two, the only way they were going to get the Americans out was via a diplomatic agreement. But there was nothing Castro could give them that would make such a trade worth it. And thus, Cuba had to resort to diplomatic nagging. And it will shock you to learn that this didn't work, and the United States remains there until this day.
Who could have guessed that Fidel Castro, a dictator in a communist country, didn't get any international help? Who could have guessed? Isn't Cuba still communist to this day? So yeah, the answer as to why didn't Castro try to retake Guantanamo Bay is because he couldn't. He had no chance of ever retaking it. And that won't change anytime in the foreseeable future. And yeah, I mean, I think everything I wanted to say, I said during the video, so I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. If you want to see more reactions, check out this video right here, and with that, I hope I'll see you in the next video.